morning, everyone, and welcome to this episode of ASFI CCA's China's DeepSeek Moment webinar series. My name is Lizzi C. I'm a fellow at the Center for China Analysis here at ASFI, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's conversation. Today, we're diving into what we are calling the other US-China nuclear war, not about weapons, but about power in both the narrow and the broad sense. Specifically, we're talking about small modular reactors, or SMRs, and how China is quietly but ambitiously placing nuclear energy at the center of its AI strategy. SMRs were once considered generally a futuristic energy solution, but China now sees them as a way to unlock massive compute power in regions where grid capacity is weak, with the world's first operational fourth-gen SMR online and dozens more under construction. This isn't theory in China anymore. It's actually happening. And of course, it raises question for the US. Why is China pulling ahead? And what makes the China model work? And can the United States catch up without becoming China? We're so lucky to be joined by three fantastic panelists today who bring deep and diverse expertise on the subject. First, we have Cory Combs, Associate Director at Trivium China, where he leads research on climate, energy, and industrial policy. Hi, Cory.
Hello.
And we have Stephen Ezell, Vice President for Global Innovation Policy at ITIF, and also from ITIF, Dr. Robin Gaster, Research Director at the Center for Clean Energy Innovation. Hello, Stephen. Hello, Robin.
Good morning.
So, Cory, I want to kick things off with you with a framing question. We've just come out of the London trade talks this month, and the 6-month rare earth licensing agreement was arguably the key breakthrough from the meetings. So what's your read on that, and how does it reflect China's broader approach to resource and energy security? What are some of the recent developments that you're tracking?
Right, absolutely. So there's kind of two pieces that unpack on this side. There is, I think, first of all, really glad to be having this discussion. I think there are some really underexplored interplays between rare earths and more broadly critical mineral policy and the nuclear development that China has underway. So really interesting space to operate in. But first, I know many are interested in the topic du jour, the rare earth export controls and the breakthrough thereof, with China, claiming or committing to loosen its restrictions, specifically toward the US. The quick take on the trade talks themselves and the clarification out of London is that substantively, there's much less than meets the eye. Politically, it is still a very salient breakthrough. So let me break that down. Practically, coming out of Geneva, I mean, we said very, very quickly after Geneva that the two sides had fundamentally disagreed on what they'd actually agreed to. It was very clear to us, and from our reading of the Chinese side and from discussions with the folks in Beijing, that there was no intention to remove rare earths or really any mineral from the license requirements themselves. There was a promise that those controls would not be weaponized specifically against US interests, with the exception that, of course, nothing would go to military uses. That's the whole point of, officially the point of dual use export controls in the first place. So China had agreed to not weaponize this. The US seems to have thought that they'd agreed to just not have the process. Of course, that was not the case, and of course led to a lot of back and forth. And in typical fashion, the US, felt aggressed against and so started to escalate further. So with London, really what I think has happened is Beijing fundamentally agreed to what it had already agreed to, but in clearer terms. And potentially moved up a little bit, maybe accelerated, just pushing some of the export license approvals that were already well underway, probably 30 days, 25, 30 days into the review process, which we expected to take 35 to 45 days. It maybe accelerated that kind of last push across the line, but most importantly gave the US the ability to claim a political win for something that fundamentally didn't change very much. So the 6 months in question, Beijing has agreed to allow kind of a review period for the process for the exports that are approved. Note that there was already going to be a 1-year review for any exports that were approved in any way. That's just kind of built into the rules. So one thing I'd like to stress is that fundamentally nothing has changed. Beijing has not removed rare earths from the dual use control list or from requirements. They have maybe pushed a few things for now ahead in terms of timeline a little bit, which is good news for producers, certainly. But those controls are going to remain in place, and we're going to have the same leverage and the same potential for retaliation moving forward. Now, that said, I do think it is really important that London happened because it has kind of put a limit on the liability of the US to further escalate. It's created a sense of calm, it's given a political victory, and it's allowed both sides to say, hey, we're going to pause for now. Now, whether that holds is a whole different question, but that's kind of the top line. It matters, but not necessarily in a lot of the ways people would like it to. So, with that said, it really points to the broader kind of resource policy that Beijing has. There's obviously several elements to natural resource governance and policy in Beijing. There's the energy security side. There's industrial security for everything else besides energy that minerals go into. There's trade and geopolitics. Clearly, these export controls have been weaponized and are negotiating and bargaining chips. And so these are all integrated. But really, when we really boil down all the genuine intricacies of Chinese natural resource policy, I think the bottom line is fairly straightforward. And it might sound obvious, but it's not actually practiced the same way in every country. But that is minimize your risk. Quite simply, a lot of that for China has to do with self-sufficiency because it has natural resources in many cases to enable that. Obviously, China's self-sufficiency in rare earths goes a little beyond that mark and hits, basically global dependence on China for rare earths. In other cases, we see China pursuing effectively similar policies, but with different outcomes. For example, lithium. China is very dependent on a US treaty ally and a US economic partner, Australia and Chile, for example, for lithium. But China is a source of all the world's batteries, leading batteries right now. So it has to be very proactive in developing domestic resource, as well as investing directly in its own projects in those two countries and foreign sources to diversify its risks. And meanwhile, we have, and this is where the nuclear discussion comes in, uranium is a particular challenge for China in one sense, and not in another, in that China really does not have all the uranium it needs for its own domestic nuclear use, referring to Gen 3 and prior reactors, the traditional kind of pressurized water reactor, large-scale, gigawatt-plus scale systems. A lot of its uranium, both the natural and the enriched, comes from Kazakhstan. Another major portion of the enriched comes from Russia, right? And there's a couple others. Namibia's got a little bit of natural. Broadly speaking, though, we don't look at China's natural resource policy as simply everything domestic. Remember, the framing was reduce the risk. Kazakhstan does not pose a huge risk to China. And Russia certainly does not either. But it's still boosting domestic sources, of course, but it's a little more tolerant. I think that's why we see nuclear having budded in China in the first place. If, for example, uranium was something more akin to, say, LNG, where it's really, dominated by the US and others in its sphere of influence, you would see what's happening in that sector for energy, where China refuses to be more dependent on LNG. Right, it has the ability to pull back because it is subject to that leverage that the US has. So if uranium were coming from other sources, we would see a completely different landscape of nuclear development in China, would be my argument. Now, where this gets really interesting, and I cannot wait for Stephen and Robin's insights on the kind of development of new Gen 4 reactors. I'm particularly curious about TMSR, thorium molten salt reactor. It's currently in pilot stage, but to me, it's one of the most fascinating cases in multiple regards for China, especially when it comes to AI. And I'll get to that in a later round of discussion. What's really interesting is that the main source of thorium, incidentally, is monazite, which is one of the two main sources of rare earths in China.
Right.
And so the city or the region of Bayan Obo, in the city of Baotou, is the rare earths capital of the world. Incidentally, it is also arguably one of the best sources for thorium. And China, just from the tailings of Bayan Obo alone, China could, in principle, have as much thorium as it wants for basically, as long as it wants, theoretically. We'll see about the economics. And so thorium raises the question of, can it further reduce resource dependencies in the next generation of nuclear? And another question I specifically have for Robin is to what extent does that versus other systems, if they're more uranium dependent, et cetera, could that also play into China's ability to have leverage over global nuclear development? Certainly with Hualong 1, China seeks to export that reactor. What about the resource side as well?
Yeah.
But also take that if thorium becomes the model for the future. So a lot of interesting interplay here. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cory. And I certainly share your curiosity about Robin's take. So, Robin, let's just bring you in here. I mean, there's a lot of hype, confusion, fear around nuclear, especially when we start to talk about SMRs and its ability to power next gen technology. Can you just walk us through why this matters, some of the, misconceptions and challenges that Cory mentioned, please?
Sure. I think the thing that's striking about what Cory said is how um, different national energy profiles have different consequences. The US has a ton of cheap natural gas. It has solar, it has wind, and the shift to natural gas has made it less necessary and more difficult to develop nuclear because it's not competitive. It costs too much. So the key sort of the key thing for SMRs is that unlike big nuclear in the US, they offer some possibility that costs will be reduced over time. And it's really, this is the sort of central feature of SMRs. Yes, they're more flexible. Yes, you can build them at different sizes. You can stack them. You can do a lot more things than you can do with just one giant, large reactor. Yes, all that's good. But the critical thing is that you might be able to build all or part of them in factories. And if you can do that, then you have the chance that you can get onto the cost reduction path that you see from other technologies like solar and batteries, where Wright's law kicks in, and every time Wright's law is just an empirical observation that in factory built products, every time you double the amount of product, you reduce the cost by something on the order of 10 to 15%. So you have to keep doubling. And of course, once you've doubled a few times, it's harder to double. And at the same time, the actual cost reduction declines because you're already far down the curve. Nonetheless, that is where SMRs have to go if they're going to become relevant in the United States. Second point is that because of this scaling thing, SMRs have to be seen as a global industry, right? You can't do enough scaling in one country. Not even China can do enough scaling in one country. So we are going to see international competition in SMRs once they finally start to take off. And China has obviously seen that, obviously decided that the best way to get a head start is to get down that curve as far as possible, as fast as possible themselves. A second point to understand about SMRs is that they are very new technology, at least some of them are very new technology. Some of them are based on pressurized water reactors, like NuScale, for example. And their concept is, okay, we know how to do this. The only issue is scale. Let's build them quickly and get to scale. It's hard, but the alternative is to say, well, no, the existing technology is not good enough. We need new technology, and we need to, like thorium, for example, in China, we need to find ways to make nuclear better, perhaps by using new designs that are inherently safer or use different fuels. So you have these two kind of competing models. Let's use what we know, and get down the curve as quickly as possible, versus let's build something new that's much better, even if it takes a little longer, especially in a world of heavily regulated products. So the third thing to remember out of this is we are at a very early stage. I like to compare this to the US auto industry in 1900. In 1900, there were more than 1,000 car manufacturers. Everybody knew how to make a car. It was very simple. So everybody who was a blacksmith tried to make a car. And we had 1,000 companies. And 20 years later, we had 3. Everything had shaken out. But it took 20 years of tremendous iteration and an explosion of new technologies like brakes and steering and headlights. They didn't think of seatbelts at that time, but you get the point. Um, so we're at that stage in SMR development for new SMRs. We're in the discovery phase, and it's a sort of existential challenge for SMR companies to decide whether they are going to innovate or whether they're going to scale. And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that yet. And this takes me to the fourth point, which is timing. We've heard there's been lots of excitement about how SMRs can be used to power data centers. Well, data centers will need that electricity in the next 3, 4, 5 years. And the first SMRs in the US won't be deployed for 5 years. We're not going to get to scale until 2040 at the very, very earliest. So you have to remember, we're at an early stage. There's a tremendous amount of hype, but it's going to take us a long time to get to the point where nuclear is competitive. And that's where the question of China comes in, really. China at the end of last year, I mean, Stephen is going to talk about this, but I was struck that China announced they were going to build 10 new big reactors for $22.7 billion, something, maybe it was 27.2. My brain is not. Now, that's just an announcement, but it can be compared to the French who announced at the same time they were building 6 for more than 60 billion. Right? So 4 times as expensive. Now, maybe part of that is that China has cheaper labor. Maybe there are regulatory things going on. Maybe there are tons of hidden subsidies that we don't know about. But that's a huge difference in price. And if we're moving into a world where we have commodity SMRs at high scale, if China can produce them at that price, it's going to be at so much lower price, it's going to be very difficult for us to compete. I would also say that China has, as Cory has pointed out, that this policy of national self-sufficiency, and we don't. Whatever the Trump administration may say, we don't have a coherent, systematic policy towards that. And I would argue that in the United States, certainly large reactors are not a strategic industry. They just are not strategic. They don't have upstream linkages that are important. They don't power uniquely downstream industries. So if you compare it to the auto industry, where you have tons of research and development upstream, and you have this whole set of tiered suppliers upstream, and downstream you have the dealers, and you have servicing, and you have a huge ecology. None of that is going to exist for big nuclear, even if it does deploy in the US. So it's not a strategic industry, but SMRs might be. We'll have to see, given the very complex energy ecology that is emerging with renewables, SMRs might be. So I've talked too much already.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robin. And over to you, Stephen. So help us understand why and where is China actually strong when it comes to SMRs? Is it about scale, effectiveness, industrial capacity, state backing, or is there more to the story? And how much tangible progress is China actually making here?
Well, thanks, Lizzie, for the invitation to participate. So ITIF looked at this in a report we issued last summer titled How Innovative is China in Nuclear Power? And I think the key point for your audience to understand is that China has made a whole of government, whole of society push toward nuclear power. China intends to build a total of 150 new nuclear reactors between 2020 and 2035, with 27 currently under construction. It's taking them an average of 6 to 8 years to deploy these reactors, and at this rate, China will surpass the US in nuclear power output by the end of this decade. Now, to be sure, many of the reactors China is deploying are older third generation type nuclear reactors. However, China is leading across the board in designing, developing, and deploying these so-called fourth generation nuclear reactors. In fact, the Gen 4 International Forum has identified 6 different types of Gen 4 nuclear reactors. I won't go into them all, but these are things like lead cooled fast reactors, molten salt reactors, supercritical water cooled reactors. The point is that China is the only country in the world that is actively building each of these 6 different types of reactors. And they're doing so because, they want to understand these technologies, they want to understand the cost curves, the economics, throwing a lot of stuff at the wall, see what works, see which is going to be, most economical and most efficient. So then when we look at SMRs in particular, small modular reactors, one, type of these fourth generation reactors that have passive safety systems, they don't chain, so, far safer from an environmental standpoint, less waste, et cetera. With the Linglong 1, China became the first country in the world to have a design for an SMR approved by the International Atomic Energy Administration in 2016. They began construction on 2021. It'll be operationally deployed by next year as the world's first commercially deployed small modular reactor, 125,000 kilowatts, going to deliver 1 billion kilowatt hours per year. CNNC, China National Nuclear, claims that they developed this using over 90% domestically sourced technologies. So, why this push to nuclear? I think Robin and Cory have made most of the key points. But in my view, fundamentally, it is about national power in all of its forms. Now, China talks a nice game about decarbonization and the environment, and certainly that's there. But the first point is that China wants to eliminate any foreign dependency for any critical technology or commodity, whether that's semiconductors, lithium, or oil. This is about China having self-sufficiency, the sustainability with energy production. I think the competitiveness side is critical from 2 angles. One, we've talked about the cheap nuclear for AI for data, but let's remember, China is the world's largest manufacturer, going to account for 45% of global manufacturing value added by the end of this decade. As much as Germany depended upon cheap Russian oil for its manufacturing industry, so China wants cheap nuclear to finance cheap manufacturing production of EVs and semis and solar panels, et cetera. Exports are also a critical goal. China wants to sell at least 30 the nuclear reactors to Belt and Road partners by the end of this decade and generate $150 billion from those exports. How are they doing this? Well, as industry analyst Kenneth Longo observed, quote, China doesn't have any secret sauce other than state financing, a state-supported supply chain, and a state commitment to build the technology. It's a centralized economy. They coordinate actors, they point them in the right direction, and make the ecosystem happen. I think that's a huge part of it. The other huge part of it is just money. It is subsidies and it is state financing. According to Bloomberg and the World Nuclear Association, China plans to build these plants for about $2,500 to $3,000 per kilowatt hour. That's about 1/3 of the cost of recent projects in the United States and France. As I understand, when we look at nuclear, over time, like the total cost of ownership over 10 years, 60% of it is actually the levelized cost of electricity. Because companies can get loans at about 1.4%, their kind of capitalization costs are a fraction of this. And that's why whether it's these new SMR systems or the older third generation, they're simply able to bend the cost curve. Economies of scale, Robin talked about Wright's law, cheap money, and they're this is why they're getting ahead. I will say, in conclusion, with my side, China does not currently have a stated specific goal for the number of SMRs it wishes to deploy. As I said, their SMRs are viewed as one in a mix of potential fourth generation nuclear technologies that will be deployed to purpose-intensive environments.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. And Cory, another one of our China expert here in the room. So Stephen mentioned some of the, state backing money, finance, central policy directives. Help us understand a little more about this energy push and China's broader economic ambitions. How does this all fit into China's regional development ambitions, China's AI ambitions, for example, and especially Xi Jinping's push toward the so-called new quality productive forces? Do you think this SMR push is going to materially reshape China's energy supply landscape?
Excellent. I'm glad we're treating all those together because everything you mentioned, energy, AI, industrial upgrading, the new quality productive forces, the state-led capitalism, and everything that Stephen's talking about, they are not fundamentally separate. They're all part of the same package of policy and strategic objectives. One thing I'll note is that traditionally, and this will come into the conversation around the kind of regional development and how China's the last Stephen's last point about China attacking all these different technologies at once. I think what's working very well for China is that has not worked historically as well with a very centralized industrial policy, is that it's doing a much better job as a country, as an ecosystem of matching incentives. I think in past, we look at kind of since the founding of the PRC, very state-centric industrial, like very nationalized industrial policy has failed more often than it succeeded, right? How many state-owned auto companies are globally renowned? Zero. No one's buying a Chinese pre-electric guitar. Sorry, I was talking to my friends about guitar today. Or electric car. No one's buying a gas-powered Chinese car. Now, EVs come around, highly private sector led, incredibly not initially built out by state-backed financing, and a lot of state-backed little giants and other producers up higher in the chain. And a large part of that was mapping state capabilities with private sector incentives. And so the state-led capitalism that is not just saying you will build this and you will make it work and it kind of sucks because it's not very good at driving efficiency or innovation. Now they put in the hands of the private sector. That industry is able to succeed where historically the same ideas were not able to succeed. I think nuclear is it's kind of in the middle of those things, where obviously it's much more state-led. It's a very sensitive sector. You're not going to have random companies involved in developing nuclear power, but it is one much more pluralistic than it was. CNNC and CGN were the only two actors, literally the only two actors prior to Gen 4. Now we have the Tsinghua Lab, a few other medium-sized companies, all state, kind of circling, but it's a much more pluralized ecosystem. And I think that's really important to know. The other thing is that when we talk about incentives, there are interesting overlaps between the national interest in developing new technologies, such as SMRs and others, and between regional development. In many cases, if you don't have a proper alignment between national and local objectives, then either the local interests co-opt national objectives for their own interest and often take things off the rail. Look at places like Handan and Tangshan with steel production. It was national interest to build steel. Now Beijing is saying, can we stop overproducing steel in these cities? Like, no, because our entire employment sector depends on our entire employment base depends on it. And so you now have these constant tensions, a very inefficient, very problematic sector. Here we have a wonderful conjunction of interests where right now the traditional nuclear ecosystem is, for what will be obvious reasons to those in the nuclear space, it's entirely coastal provinces, mostly the richer coastal provinces. The first reason they're coastal is because they're dependent on water for their active safety systems. You can't build this in the Gobi Desert. How are you going to keep the thing cool, and how are you going to make sure you don't have a meltdown? Meanwhile, you have, and the coastal regions tend to be much richer for a variety of historical reasons. But you also have at the same time, in Western Inner Mongolia, you have Sichuan, you have Qinghai, you have other inland provinces that really are looking for economic development. And that's why Balto ended up becoming the rare earth capital of the world. Not because rare earths were important in the 60s and 70s and 80s. They were selling it for nothing. They did it because they had nothing else to develop, largely, and it aligned with national interests. Now with SMRs and stuff, that is not just the pressurized water reactors. Obviously, there are some PWR-based Gen 4 reactors, but I'm talking about the subset that isn't. It, for the first time, meaningfully opens the possibility space for inland or hinterland provinces to develop. And even better is another synergy with AI. So right now, there's this big issue of, AI and data centers to process everything are incredibly electricity intensive, obviously, and where electricity prices are high, your costs are higher. Where are costs cheap? Inland provinces where you have tons of solar, tons of wind, and relatively little demand because industry isn't out there. And so now you have the question of, do you build data centers out east or do you build data centers out west? And so this east data west calculation system that Beijing is trying to build out, saying, why don't we just build the centers out in the desert, send the data over there, process it, and send it back? Much easier, lower cost, and now there's a development opportunity for these inland provinces. Now let's couple that with everything we're talking about with regard to energy demand. And if the especially places like near the Gobi Desert with TMSR, others and then provinces, Qinghai in particular, I'm very curious to see their development process. If they're able to connect these data center development with SMR and other non-PWR systems, suddenly you have economic opportunities that just didn't exist 10 years ago. Don't really exist today, but might become the new possibility. And for Beijing, what this means is cheaper data, more high quality development of new really important technologies, and scalability outside of just a few coastal provinces, which, as Robin was getting at earlier, is essential to start scaling the production. Obviously, you need international too, but you need to scale as much as possible domestically. You can't do that if you're restricted to just a couple coastal provinces. So all this stuff ties together very neatly in principle. Obviously, the practice is much messier. There's a lot of stuff we're looking at about disincentives and misaligned incentives. But right now, I think most of the actors involved have clear incentives to at least try. And the last point I'll put a cap on it is the worst case for Beijing would be an industrial policy that says, this is the technology of the future. Everyone, you now have to invest in this one thing. If they just said, it's all TMSR all the way, that would be a terrible policy. Why? Because no one knows which one's going to succeed. I mean, everyone's mentioned this already. And so part of the better side of modern industrial policy out of China is the same thing we saw in batteries. Beijing did not say, you will build LFP batteries or sodium ion batteries or solid state batteries. They said, make batteries and see which one wins, and we'll give the most money to the victors. And that's what's going to happen with SMR, and that's why I think there's at least a shot. No one knows which is going to win. So they're going to allow this state-supported development, which long and short comes down to a lot of low to no cost financing is the number one way they support this stuff now. You can just get cheap credit wherever you need and cheap lending. But they're going to lend to anyone who can develop a tech and see who wins. That is why I think China has a shot at developing these, where it's much more difficult for everyone else.
Fantastic.
Can I just add one thing to what you said? I think what you said about regional development is really interesting. It's really and the data center piece is I think a key to this, because the cost of energy actually is not that important for data centers. I mean, it is in the West, but to some degree. But even here, my back of the envelope calculation is that the cost of energy over the lifetime of a plant is like 5% of the cost of running a data center. It's all in the cost of the chips, right? It's all in the cost of the capital equipment. What data centers need is reliability.
Reliability, yes.
They're prepared to pay a big premium for reliability. And so if you want to have a lot of solar on the system, you need balancing technologies, and that's what it looks like. So something to consider there. They are a perfect client, perfect customer for SMRs. They don't really care about price. They just want reliability. They're looking at very long term, and they're very deep pockets. So, it's a perfect match if SMRs can actually deliver at scale before we're all wiped out by the AI revolution. Nuts.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Robin, for that follow-up. And Robin, let me continue to pick your brain a little bit.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, the United States seems to have not made comparable progress when it comes to SMR. So what's actually holding the energy sector and policymakers in the United States back? Are we just late to the game, or are there structural limits that kind of constrain us in a way that makes this even harder?
Well, a couple of things. In sharp contrast to China, one of my friends has summarized the Biden industrial policy as being all muscle and no brain. That is to say, they put a lot of money and a lot of effort into a lot of things without a great deal of strategic thought. and we're not set up to do strategic thought. So part of the and if you think about it, to do nuclear, you need a consistent, effective, persistent policy that is supported on pretty much on all sides and that people think will last for 30 years. You know, Washington, in contrast, does not work that way. Long-term thinking in Washington is what's for lunch. I mean, it's really, we have not built the capacity to do very long-term industrial policy, and that's what nuclear demands. And the circumstances here are different. I mean, I made the point, this is not a strategic industry for the US. Right now. It's not like chips, which go into everything. It's not like autos, which employ everybody. It's just not sufficiently strategic, and we don't have a self-sufficiency strategy like the Chinese. So we don't have the capability, and we don't have the desire, and we don't have the tools because we're busy, in part, dismantling them. We have the Loan Program Office, which would provide long-term financing, but we don't really know how to use it properly. And we may very well lose it in the next round of budget talks. So, we're not very well positioned to compete.
Well, thank you so much, Robin, for your take. Yeah, Cory, please jump in.
Can I actually add a piece on that? So I started my energy career out after grad school at the Loan Programs Office, and I was working on the Vogel plans, among others, as part of the portfolio management team. I was junior, obviously, at the time. But one of the key issues was that we spent, now this was during the first Trump administration, but I think this was really true across the board. Is a huge amount of the time just went into convincing Congress that a 3% loss rate was not bad for what effectively is venture capital.
Right.
I mean, to put that in context for everyone else, that's an insanely impressive rate because we weren't able to take any risks.
Well,
The risk tolerance is negligible enough.
it's too low.
It's too
It's
low.
too low.
It should be 40.
Yes.
It's
If you
insane.
want to do early stage venture capital, you need a 30%, 40% loss rate. You have
Exactly
to.
right.
Otherwise, you're wasting your time.
It was Cylinder. It was a political failure early on in the history that was an
Well, thank you so
albatross
much.
forever after.
Well, thank you so much. We can certainly continue that conversation on how to fix our political system.
Yeah.
But in the interest of being more constructive, Stephen, I'm going to turn to you. Cory and Robin mentioned those structural barriers, whether it's regulatory, political, or industrial capability, at least where we stand now, that makes perhaps the path to energy security fundamentally different here in the US. But we did see some signals, President Trump signed several executive orders on nuclear energy. There seems to be a pro-energy push, at least from the White House at this point. Are there actual realistic ways for the United States to catch up on nuclear innovation without actually becoming China? Because, the system is fundamentally different, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely there are. And it's not just that, Congress last year passed the Advance Act, which is going to reform, revolutionize our nuclear regulatory authority, hire 120 new staff for the NRC, so that they'll have the bandwidth to hopefully evaluate, these fourth generation technologies and, enhance regulatory efficiency, improve regulatory pathways. I think it's very important. If you look at the Food and Drug Administration, in 1986, it took 3 years for the FDA to make a safety and efficacy determination on any new drug. Now that's down to 10 months on average, with no loss whatsoever in approving safe and effective drugs for society. So I think other sectors show a pathway for how we can enhance our nuclear regulatory regime without sacrificing safety. And Ted Nordhaus and team at the Breakthrough Institute has written about the history of regulatory ratcheting that we've experienced, increasing regulations that really add little to safety. Hopefully, we can start to address that. A challenge for the United States is skills. The Department of Energy estimates that if the U.S. is to triple its output of nuclear energy by 2050, we're going to need 375,000 more skilled engineers, technicians, and construction personnel. So I think that is a part of our ecosystem that is often not considered enough. But to Robin's point earlier, we have companies and NuScale's out there, I won't name them all. Robin, you know all the names. It's not a question of technology. What's interesting about um, essentially China's entire base of third generation nuclear reactors was taken from Westinghouse. It was the Westinghouse technology, but it was the CAP 1000. But it took the United States 20 years to deploy the CAP 1000 with the two new Vogtle plants in Georgia, which were the first we'd built in 20 years. So essentially the point that China is decades ahead of the United States in deploying our own technologies that we've developed ourselves. So it's not a question of technological capability, I don't think here. It's a matter of national will and public will to say that the final point I'll make here is like to think about. So some people think about nuclear to think about insulin, right? The insulin today is not the ground up pig pancreas that it was in the 1950s, right? It is manufactured synthetically, right? That's the difference between nuclear power of 1950 and nuclear power today. These are entirely different entities, entirely different technologies, far safer. So let's have a new, more sophisticated conversation about nuclear in the United States and the contributions that it can make, to a clean, energy efficient, safe technology.
Can I just jump in and add one thing about the Trump orders? I don't think actually any of them are bad. I think that that they have some good things scattered throughout. But I think the sort of implication of those orders is that the solution to the U.S. Nuclear sector, the real thing we have to do is simply deregulate and let the market work. If we just deregulate far enough, we will get a nuclear sector. And I fundamentally don't believe that. I think that's not enough. We need help right across the technology deployment spectrum out into scale up. And just pretending that markets will leap in and spend on very high risk technologies that won't be deployed for 20 years is lunacy. This is simply not going to happen. No investor will do that. So unless we can de-risk and provide a pathway for investment, I don't care how deregulated they are. Nobody's going to do it.
But the key point, that's the key point, Robin. It's not that we're behind the technology. It's not that our engineers don't know how to do it. It's this ecosystem of deploying the technology
Yes.
cost effective.
And it's much harder. I mean, look, Trump wants to have 10 nuclear power plants built in the United States. That's what they announced. Well, who is going to do that? Who is going to buy them? In the United States, it's not just Chinese, the Chinese model where we say we're going to build 10 and we build 10 and thank you. Here, the utilities have to buy them, or Microsoft has to buy them. And they're not going to at the price that those things are currently available. So we have to figure out a pathway into the market and into scale. And it's so simply releasing the energies of the markets is not a solution in the US.
That's such an insight. To our panelists, Cory, Stephen, and Robin, for your very insightful takes today. It's clear that the other nuclear war, and we mentioned at the top of the program over SMRs, is not just theoretical. It's actually unfolding now and have major implications for energy, for our economy, and also for US-China dynamics in the years to come. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us. Until then, stay tuned for next episode in our China's DeepSeek Moment webinar series. Have a great day.